Hello there, and welcome to today's webcast, Overcoming Infrastructure Issues, Why Strategic Asset Management is Critical and Why You Should Care. I'm Justin Marlowe, Senior Fellow at the Center for Digital Government and Professor at the University of Chicago, and I'm happy to serve as the host for today's webinar. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great session over the next hour. Before we dive into the content, I wanted to share a few brief housekeeping notes. We will email a recording of this presentation to all registrants within 48 hours. Please use that recording for your reference or feel free to pass along to colleagues. We've designed this webcast to be interactive, and you can participate in Q&A with us by submitting your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the presentation panel. Send in your questions as they come up throughout the presentation, and we'll address as many of them as possible during the Q&A portion. For those of you interested in downloading a copy of the slides, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also during today's webcast, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. For those of you on Twitter, please use hashtag GovTechLive, that's hashtag GovTechLive, to share key takeaways, quotes, and learnings from today's webcast. At the close of the webcast, we'll encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd like to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webcast, but would like to complete the survey, simply click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will come up automatically as the webcast concludes. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any media player issues or have any other technical problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the Help button at the bottom of the console. Joining me today to discuss this topic are Akshay Prabhu, Vice President of Strategic Asset Management for Dude Solutions. Akshay has over 20 years experience in strategic asset management and was the co-founder of Ascetic, which was recently acquired by Dude Solutions. He's led the development of condition algorithms, asset valuation methods, life cycle prediction analytics, and is passionate about applying this science to close the global infrastructure renewal gap. Akshay has a directorship at the Asia Pacific Institute of Asset Management, is an adjunct professor of strategic asset management at Bond University, a Bachelor of Engineering, and is a chartered professional member of the Institution of Engineers Australia. We also have Ben Clark. Ben Clark is an award-winning asset management thought leader with demonstrated history in local government and the private sector. He's skilled in asset management, analytical skills, surveying, data mapping, and strategic modeling. Ben complements his career experience with a Master of Business Administration. Before we get to Akshay and Ben's presentation, let's put a quick poll question to all of you, the audience. That question is, what best describes your organization's asset management planning? What best describes your organization's asset management planning? The first choice is we don't have asset management plans. The second choice is we have asset management plans, but they're 2 or more years old. And the third is we have asset management plans that are 5 years old or more. Take a moment now before we get started with the presentation to give us some feedback on where your organization is at with asset management. Again, that's what describes your organization's asset management planning. We have no asset management plan, we have a plan that's 2 years old or more, and we have a plan that's 5 years old or more. And perhaps not surprising, almost half the audience says that they don't have an asset management plan, and those that do have plans that are 2+ or 5+ years old. Actually, I think that's a terrific segue into the content that you have here today to tell us all about how to go about designing and implementing asset management plans. So with that, Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. And welcome all to this webinar. And that's a great segue into understanding long-term financial planning, and quite understandable that as the world shifts from a reactive to proactive asset management planning, we are starting to look at a number of the issues that face us in relation to our asset management plans. And some of these questions that are appearing on the screen in relation to the future financial value of our assets, what is an affordable service level, what are customers expecting from these assets, how do we describe life cycle cost, can we look into the future and understand how much funding we need, what would happen if we shifted our funding between some of our asset types, what if we spend more, what if we spend less, do we have a handle on our backlog, is my backlog at an acceptable level, in delivering our assets for the future, whether they are roads or buildings or facilities or pipes, are they fit for purpose, and do we have an asset management plan that really encompasses this, which looks beyond 10 or 20 years, not just a 4-year capital plan that's purely based on fixing the worst first. When you look at these questions in totality, the answers to these questions feed the content of a typical asset management plan. And the maturity and the development of this content and the maturity and the level of at which we can answer these questions will determine our asset management plan's context from a futuristic perspective. So why long-term financial planning is because typically as we look at the infrastructure around the world at the moment, whether it's in any Western economy like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, etc., around the world, the one fundamental item that is on everyone's minds is this context around infrastructure deficit and planning. And I'm sure everyone in the room would have heard at some point around the American Institute of Engineers report card. There have been calls from ISO 55000 about long-term financial planning and the need to be in control of 10 years plus. The Accounting Standards Board in the United States, as well as in Canada, have now started to make really good statements around looking into the future beyond 10 years and not just a 2 to 3 year window. And understanding that context is really about understanding life cycle and infrastructure deficit. And these are not motherhood words or hypothetical issues. These are real issues because any asset, whether it's a pipe or a building or a road or a sidewalk or a water utility or power utility asset, over a period of time, assets will degrade, infrastructure will degrade, and the capacity and functional fitness of that infrastructure, which is typically called the level of service provided by that infrastructure, starts to degrade typically from an A to F, or a 1 to a 5, or a green to a red as time passes. But when you look at this particular profile without getting caught up too much in the accuracy of its shape, when you look at this profile, the rate at which these assets start to get consumed when they get into the C- or the D+ phase, that rate exponentially increases as they enter the D to the E phase. And as more and more infrastructure, more and more of the assets start to enter into this yellow to the red phase, what we see is typically called an infrastructure deficit because our capacity, our financial capacity to pay for the renewal and the upkeep of that infrastructure significantly is lower than the rate at which they're getting consumed. So there's two really important things here. One is when you read a report card that says our infrastructure is at a D plus or an E minus, it doesn't necessarily mean all our bridges, all our dams, all our roads, all our highways, all our buildings are at a D plus or an E minus. What that means is a vast majority of our assets may be in the B to D stage, but we are starting to see a creep appearing in the D to the E, which should send alarm bells about the fact that we need to do something about it. An infrastructure deficit is also not a constant fixed number. It will start to grow if we as custodians are not doing something about arresting or reducing that backlog, increasing from the C's and the D's into the E's and the F's. And strategic asset management is really about understanding the spending of the money so that we invest our money really wisely from the C's to the F's in order to make the best life cycle decisions into the future. For example, do I fix a low priority asset at an F at a cost of $1,000, or do I fix a high priority asset at a D at a cost of $200? Which one gives me better bang for buck? Which one gives me a higher level of service? And this conundrum becomes really, really interesting when you consider that everyone around the table here would be a custodian of at least anywhere from 2,000 assets to 2 million assets. And when you look at the quantum of those assets competing with each other, pipes versus roads, roads versus roads, buildings versus other buildings, but also buildings versus your sidewalks and pipes. When that happens and there is competition for the scarce dollar, the optimization of that spend, how to best spend it so we end up with the least amount of assets in the reds, least amount of assets in the E's and the F's, and we stop that infrastructure deficit from growing is the real essence of strategic asset management. So understanding it from a life cycle perspective, I'd now like to bring in Ben Clark, who is an industry practitioner and has worked around some really interesting government asset portfolios and worked with public sector officers to give his view on where a practitioner sees this deficit being something that needs to be looked at and solved.
Thanks, Ashay. So, as Ashay mentioned, I've worked in local government. What I see is it's really about educating the elected members. So from this slide here, you can see I've worked at a number of different places, a large municipality, 100,000 residents, 600-kilometre road network, a capital city of 30,000 residents, but over 500,000 visitors per day to the region, and then a small scale with 8,000 residents and a very small road network. But they all have the same issues. It's just the quantum changes. So what it's about as practitioners is about educating our elected bodies, our executive, about what the infrastructure gap or infrastructure deficit is, and that it's not just a one-off, we can throw some money at it and the problem goes away. It's that it's an ongoing, ever-changing number that as we move through the infrastructure ages, the yellows become red. It's about looking at the performance of the assets rather than just doing the worst first. Where is our high priorities? What is going to have the biggest impact to our communities? And spending our money there. We've really tried to use industry standards. So we use the IPWA infrastructure manuals. There's the IIM, the International Infrastructure Management Manual, and then there's the IIF, the Financial Management Manual. They're very, very important resources in Australia for education purposes, and we've found that we can actually see real world benefits in terms of savings just by highlighting infrastructure gap, looking at the link to levels of service, and then making decisions based on that.
Thanks, Ben. So the key message there is about how do we identify the infrastructure gap, Ben's expertise in a large city, then the complexity of a capital city, and then finally in a small organization, the town of Walkerville. What we see there is the problems were identical. They were all trying to solve a future issue. They were all trying to look at how to spend their money wisely. They all had an infrastructure deficit, but over a period of 2 to 3 years, they were able to get in control of that backlog and get to a point where they were demonstrating savings to the citizens, as well as providing a significantly better output than the traditional methodologies. And what does that mean in real life? In real life, from an infrastructure perspective, as the world shifts to constrained funding and determining other areas that are potentially going to require monies into the future, for asset management practitioners, how the future budgets are determined is really, really fundamentally critical. And the proof point for this is many Western economies are now bringing in regulation around how assets are valued and how future budgets are set. And he or she who has the most formidable story is most likely to get the next round of stimulus or available funding. And what does that all mean? So from an infrastructure perspective, whether you're a finance professional or the director of engineering or a CFO, the question is, how do we determine our budgets? And around the globe, you will see that there are some organizations that simply use depreciation or amortization as a method. Some organizations will predict the future based on the past, which is simply saying it's last year plus or minus 5%, and we'll find out what happens 5-10 years down the track where we get to. And then there are organizations really thought-leading strategic asset management planning, got in the level of control, which means the budgets are actually based on future needs, not last year plus or minus 5%. They're actually based on future service levels. What type of facilities will we need? What condition should our roads be in? What level of reliability should our pipes and our power networks be providing? How is the demographic shifting? What are the likely drivers of the younger population or aged care? And based on that, how do we set our budgets? So let's just see what that means from an infrastructure planning perspective. And I've given an example of a sidewalk here. A really easy example to grasp. And if this sidewalk was the only asset that we were responsible for, to keep it really simple, then from a financial perspective, using simple depreciation, in my asset register, you can see here, it was built in this particular year, and it has an area of roughly about 300 square meters. The engineers have assessed it at the moment to be in condition 2 or a green or a level B, so it's in pretty good shape. And therefore, from a budgeting perspective, you would say that the gross replacement cost of that asset divided by an estimated life of 50 years gives me a depreciation of roughly 600,000 per annum. And in the absence of anything else, that could be a simple rough guide to say how much money do we need to put away or invest in order to be able to provide in the future for any capital or maintenance work that is required on that sidewalk. Really simple, first principles based on depreciation. We move to the next methodology, which is about life cycle planning, strategic asset management, and we look at this from a futuristic lens, not purely a historical lens. So what we're now looking at is the future service level of that same sidewalk over a 50-year period. And this is where strategic asset management gets really interesting, because that infrastructure deficit and budgeting all comes back to a level of service. And I emphasize, it comes back to a level of service very similar to family planning, where we might say my future is about sending both my kids to private school, having a overseas holiday every year, and I also want to have a holiday home. That high level of service will require a different financial plan, will have a different level of infrastructure deficit, or in this case, family deficit, and will have a different tactic required to achieve that target. So in this case, if this sidewalk is considered high criticality because it connects to an auditorium, is predominantly used multiple times during the day, is high risk, then based on that life cycle plan, the engineers will have the knowledge and the experience to come up with what life cycle activities will be required over the 50-year life of that footpath. And this is basically what a predictive model looks like. It says at about condition D or a 3.5, I will do a partial renewal on that sidewalk, which is roughly going to cost me 10 grand, the green bars here. And when it gets to an end of life, which is at about an F, I will do a full rehabilitation because it's a high priority footpath and return it back to its original service level for about $22,000. And note that none of those are the original cost of construction, which the depreciation method was using. And on an annual basis, we're going to do a lot of maintenance work because we want to keep that footpath safe and serviceable. And when you add all those costs over a 50-year period, uninflated at this stage to keep it really simple, we end up with what is called a life cycle cost, which then gets annualized to an annual figure that says my equivalent annual cash flow to preserve, maintain, and deliver a high level of service for that particular sidewalk or footpath is roughly about $1,400. Not $600, but it's about $1,400 because it's a high priority sidewalk. Very similarly, in the engineer strategic asset management platform, you now look at that sidewalk as if it was a low priority sidewalk. The focus shifts, and now no longer are we saying we will do the minor rehabs or the partial rehabilitations. We will in fact wait till it gets to a lower level and then repair it with a $10,000 partial renewal, not a full reconstruction because it's a low priority footpath. And all of these decisions are based on community expectations, the organizational ability to fund, the decision model that the organization has developed as part of its asset management plan, and should be the way long-term financial plans are developed, not last year plus or minus 5%. But this now gives us an option for that sidewalk. If it was a low priority sidewalk, the cost of that sidewalk over a 50-year period is now only $520 per annum, which in fact is less than what depreciation was guiding and saying. So the simple story here is, as GASB, the Accounting Standards Board, or ISO 55000, or the Institute of Public Works Engineering, or CNAM in Canada, as these organizations are starting to look at the future and looking at billions of dollars invested in our infrastructure assets, the question becomes, which budget is right? Is it $1,450 because it's a high priority sidewalk? Is it $520 because it's a low priority sidewalk? Or is it in fact $256 because it's based on historic depreciation? Or is it $600 because it's based on current replacement depreciation or amortization? And this is a really fundamental question, because as custodians of infrastructure, with a report card that is somewhere between a C to a E, with an infrastructure deficit that is looming, we have got an incredible opportunity as practitioners to make a shift to strategic asset management to enable us to A, plug that infrastructure deficit, but also be in control about what really the future funding should represent. And this is the real nugget as we head into the era of strategic asset management. And I'd like to bring on the practitioner, Ben Clark, once again into this debate to talk about his experience in all levels of organization about the magnitude and the consequence of this margin for error.
Thanks, Ashley. So we've really seen a shift over the last 20 years in Australia, moving from using the traditional method one, depreciation, as the budget. In Australia, we realised that we had billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, and over the last 20 years, we've grown from, say, 20 million people having to pay for it, that we realised we needed to find a better way to manage this, and hence Australia's moved to methods 2 and 3, so your high level of service and your low level of service as the basis for our budgeting. What it allows organisations to do is find out what the community actually wants, what are they willing to pay for, and then the strategic asset management looks into the future to see, okay, how much do we need for the life cycle of this asset to actually manage it at the level at which the community wants. We can now create the digital twins and have our assets mirrored in systems that allow the engineers to collect data and different types of performance measures to see how our assets are tracking, generate these life cycle costings, and then budget accordingly. What we've been able to see in the organisation I've worked in is that in some cases we were over-servicing our communities, what they wanted in terms of their sidewalks in particular areas. We could actually reduce the level of service to free up capital to spend on our community, what our communities deemed as the more important assets. So we actually found we could help to shrink our infrastructure deficit by understanding the whole of life cycle costs. When are we going to intervene on an asset? When are we going to renew it? Is it a partial renewal? Is it a full renewal? Are we going to upgrade it? Are we going to let it run to end of life and then dispose of it? All these questions we can actually answer and look at over the life cycle of the asset and then really understand our budgets. What this means is we can budget in a way that means that we are lowering the infrastructure deficit to a point that becomes manageable, and our level of service then reflects our infrastructure deficit, where we can continue to fund that.
Thanks, Ben. And Ben will be presenting some real-life scenarios when we get to the latter part of this session. And Ben's message there was just looking at this really simple example. If our margin for error in budgeting was $1,000 per sidewalk, and we had 2,000 sidewalks, I'm keeping it really, really simple here. We are already behind the 8 ball in terms of presenting our budgets to our stakeholders, and as strategic asset management custodians, as investment planners for the future, as responsible for our future generations, we are lacking that financial control in a sense that we should be responsible for. And it all comes down to accountability. An accountability that says, am I in an organization that has got a singular voice where the CFO, the engineer, the director of works, the corporate planning department, the capital planning department, all is singing from the same asset register, the same strategic asset management plan that has got a clear view of the future. There is nothing worse for a taxpayer than not having access to reliable information where the engineer claims that a school roof has got 5 years left because of the health assessment done on the roof, and that he or she needs $60,000 sometime in the next 5 years to fix it. But the CFO, who is struggling to see the future because he or she has only got access to the financial data purely from an amortization perspective, based on age, the data that they've got says we've still got 35 years in that roof. Now imagine this happened with our bridges, with our road pavements, with our pipes. How do we defend our asset management plan to our citizens? How do we have a conversation around what the rates and the taxes should be set at? How do we communicate to the stakeholders about what service levels we can afford to deliver or need to trade off? These are questions of accountability, which are not rocket science questions, provided these fundamental bits of information are considered in long-term financial planning. And the assimilation of all this is really what an asset management plan is. So let's look at some thought leaders. Let's look at those 15% of organizations around the world that have now moved to generation 4 of strategic asset management and are saving millions of dollars every year and cutting the infrastructure gap. And the most amazing one at the moment, very recent one, is Topeka, city of Topeka in Kansas, where they have employed this level of data and technology to look at the problem that they had, which was about the half-cent retail sales tax. And this sales tax was actually funding their future street renewal, which is all the repairs and the upgrades and the replacements as their streets get to the point of intervention. And point of intervention, I repeat, doesn't mean when the asset dies. It is based on the level of service, so it could be significantly before the asset dies, because Topeka has got a strategic asset management framework. And they needed to have the evidence to say, if this tax was taken away from us, what would be the impact on our community? And they had to look beyond 2 years, and this is the critical piece, looking beyond 2 years to have a really long-term view of understanding the problem. So the first thing they did was articulate what the current state of the assets looked like in a simple pictorial form on a GIS, which distributed their condition of their streets from an A to an F or a green to a red, and gave the community and their board and their councillors and their mayor a description of what the world looked like today. The question then becomes what the world looks like in the future. And full credit to Jason Peake, who is the Public Works Director at Topeka, where the focus was beyond 5 years. It wasn't just the next 5 years, but the focus was on 20 years to say, can we see evidence-based prediction of our future actions now? Can we have the benefit of hindsight now instead of in 2030? Can we look at multiple options of the future now to be able to put the evidence of not just what would happen if we didn't get the money we need, but what would we be able to do if we got a little bit more funding? Could we actually eradicate completely our funding gap? And here is a classic outcome of what they achieved. Spending money the traditional way, which was fixing the Fs and the Fs and more Fs and more Fs at the expense of the Ds and the Es, showed them through the modeling that they would end up with literally 10% of their asset portfolio in cherry red. At the moment, they don't have 10%, they have roughly about 3 or 4% in cherry red. But moving forward, the software was able to give them an alternative way, and I repeat, an alternative way to spend exactly the same amount of money, which is about $2.5 million a year, but they end up with only 4.7% of their streets in the very poor to the poor state. The difference between the two isn't extra money. The difference between the two is using existing data to spend the money differently between the Ds and the Es and the F assets in order to substantially eradicate the infrastructure deficit, as opposed to constantly grow from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 to a 7 to a 10%. To the point where the city decision makers came back and asked the Topeka engineers to analyze the network to show them how much money is required to completely eradicate that infrastructure gap. So now there is a dialogue that is possible between the decision makers and the asset planners to say, how can we spend the money better? Or alternatively, how much more can we afford to completely eradicate the gap if that's the way we wanted to go? Or how much money do we need or can we save if the cherry red assets only occurred on the really, really low priority assets? So it gives you the option from a strategic asset management perspective to look at the future and guide the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Very similar, Department of Education in Tasmania, which is a facility portfolio spread over this beautiful state in Australia. It's an island within an island, 72 schools spread across the state, and a really great case study of evidence-based justification to the state government. Very recent example of how a facility organization got to the bottom of understanding their data, presented a 25-year financial plan with all the modeling scenarios to the state government, and was very, very successful in justifying the why and the what, was very successful in connecting to an asset management plan and able to get a stimulus funding of roughly about $110 million to eradicate the gap, as well as make sure that they don't have any priority buildings in the E and the F. And the reason they got the funding wasn't necessarily just because the stimulus funding was available, but they honestly got the funding because of all the competing departments. They had a compelling story which was based on evidence, which was based on decision-making logic, and which showed the stakeholders and the government the future impact of the long-term decisions. So what you see here again with the Department of Education is starting off in the current 2020 year, where majority of the assets were in state D. There was a very high likelihood that over a period of 10 to 20 years, majority of the assets would end up in the D to an F, with quite a significant portion appearing in that F state. They've now got strategic asset management, which spends exactly the same amount of money differently across that entire 72 school portfolio to return an outcome which at least ensures that there is nothing in cherry red, and substantially more assets are getting and preserved in the dark green to the green phase. And what this has done is allowed them to unlock hidden capital and save the future without necessarily raising taxes or spending more money. The $110 million additional they receive is an additional option which eradicates the gap and returns a significantly better level of service for the school students over the next 10, 20 years. So seeing the future now from that perspective, the ability to present these dashboards to the community, the government, is the future way of representing an asset management plan. And it's about unlocking that hidden capital. I'll hand over now to Ben Clark, because Ben has done a really fantastic practitioner story at the City of Adelaide, a complex city. And a complex look at multiple asset classes, not just roads or not, and demonstrated how competing demands can be taken into account, where a city like this has to make decisions and justify those decisions to its ratepayers and to its council. So I'll hand over to Ben.
Thanks, Ashay. So yeah, this was my recent place where I rolled out some strategic asset management. A bit of a snapshot just in the City of Adelaide. Around $1.4 billion worth of assets, 140 kilometre road network, about double the footpath network. Using strategic asset management, we had estimated savings of about $1 million per annum on a $5 million budget, and footpaths around 300,000 savings on a $2 million budget. But by undertaking the strategic asset management and the optimization, we could actually do more with the same dollars. So we didn't hand back that $1 million or that 300,000. We were able to spend that on our other asset classes like water, buildings, and our open space assets. So our capital budget didn't have to increase. We just spent it in a more wise manner. So as a part of, we did a major asset management transformation project. As a part of that was strategic asset management, and it was about, rather than just rolling out a system, it was about rolling out a cultural change to the organisation and changing the way that we manage our assets for the community. So these are just a snapshot of some of the reports we use, as I mentioned earlier, about educating our elected members, the executive, and just the business as a whole. Some of these dashboards are what we produce to speak to our assets and give an idea of where we're at. So this one here is a high-level summary of the state of our assets. We can see at a glance, this is live, our current condition on the right there at 2.22, our current backlog or infrastructure deficit, the number of road segments and the like. We can slice and dice this data how we want to help paint the picture for the people that are looking at it. So this here, we were able to, using some optimization, actually have a COVID-related funding model where we had significant drop in our revenue as an organisation, meaning that we had to trim our budgets significantly. What we're able to do, and this is the example of our road network, we could say, okay, if we spend nothing for the next 2 years and then incrementally increase it back to our $5 million spend over the 4 years after that, what does that do to our assets? And traditionally, you'd look at you might do a 5-year program, and on the graph on the top left there, you can see that over the first 5 years, there's really very little impact to the overall network. It's not until you look at year 10, 15, out to 20 that you start to see those cherry red assets increase significantly. So you can see that we're clearly underspending based on our level of service that we said we're going to provide to the community. They're actually going to end up with a significant deficit at the end of that period. So what we could able to do is we could then communicate that back and say, okay, when we trade this off against other assets, is our road network more important than our open space infrastructure like barbecues, park benches, bins and street furniture? What do we, as an organisation, where do our priorities lie and where does the community's priorities lie? So we did this, this is just the roads, we did this across multiple asset classes so we could see the impacts that they're all going to have. If I flick to the next slide, you can see that it doesn't look that much different, but when I flick between the two, you can see the cherry reds increase significantly in the first slide. So this is if we continue on our current infrastructure spend of $5 million per year, we end up with some cherry reds, but the way we've built our model is that is actually some of our local laneways and low priority roads. So that's acceptable for us to have those cherry reds there. We can let those go to end of life and renew them at that point. But our high priority and our major roads, our roads at buses and transport routes are all renewed at a rate that is affordable and is going to meet community demand. When we go to the next slide, this is where, as a practitioner, it's really exciting because this is the digital twin view of our asset. So each one of those lines is an individual asset, and we can actually see over the next 20 years, how does that asset degrade? What's its performance? What is it looking like? So you can see it goes from green to yellow and then it backs to green. So at the top there's some of our higher priority car parks. So we don't want them to exceed that condition of, I think it's a 3.5, between 3.5 and a 4, or a sort of a C or a D, that we wouldn't let it exceed that. So it gets renewed at about year 15 and then continues back from brand new and continues on its life. The other ones down further, we can see they go from orange into red. They're the ones that we've deemed as a low priority. We're happy for them to just continue on at a lower level of service, and then at some point they will be renewed, but they're going to be traded off against the higher priority infrastructure. And then finally, probably the most exciting thing is that we can actually visualize our next 10-year capital works program. We can see where, what, and how we're going to be treating our assets. This is just looking at roads. We have another one that shows all of our asset classes, so we can actually look to group up projects and look at, in 10 years, we may need to go and seek external funding or grant funding or government support. So we can actually go to the government with a plan of when and what we need to be doing in the next 10, 15, 20 years, and start to talk and communicate with them and other, whether it be private equity as well, about whether we can get them to help invest in our infrastructure to ensure we meet the demand of the community moving forward.
Great, thanks, Ben. That's a really great way of summarizing strategic asset management. I'd just like to spend 30 seconds on the practitioner's role. This is a really, really important thing for North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., where we're now seeing a significant shift to a 25-year view, a 10-year budget, as opposed to the traditional 4-year capital investment plans. The focus beyond the 5-10 years is really important, because if we as custodians don't demonstrate the long-term impacts, it's likely to mean that the infrastructure deficit will be significantly larger, and it will be something that will be extremely tedious to cope with when we get to those points in 2030 and beyond. And thought leadership from GASB and PSAB, the M4I in Canada, these are really important thought leadership forums, because we are starting to now hear in North America really good statements from GASB in particular around long-term financial planning, around the need to have preservation funding for long-term life cycle management of assets. And it's really good to see that long-term actually means 10, 15, 20 years plus, and not just 3 to 5 years. And everything that Ben just showed, which is quite exciting to see, is the digital dashboards. In fact, the fact that they are live, the fact that they can be distributed electronically as a simple URL, means that the asset management plans are no longer those 100, 200-page documents that sit on a shelf and gather dust. This is the really, really big game shift, because cloud computing, digital plans, the ability to see dashboards means organizations are allowed and able to collaborate between their departments, from finance to engineering to capital planning, but the digital dashboards also allow stakeholder consultations to happen at a government level, at a political level, as well as a board or a council level. And that's the shift that is making strategic asset management so much more enabling at the moment, where anyone with a little amount of data, even the most basic of information, can get a Generation 1 asset management plan, and someone with Generation 3 or Generation 4 data can embark on a really generation-rich, mature journey straight off the bat. On that note, I hope this has been useful and enjoyable. I hand over to Justin for a poll question.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Terrific presentation. Look forward to discussing it with the audience here a little bit more. So I'd encourage everyone in the audience to be thinking about and go ahead and submit questions for the live Q&A that we'll have here in just a moment. Before we do that, we wanted to, as Ashley mentioned, put another couple quick poll questions to you, just so we can gather a little bit more information on where everyone is with strategic asset management before we go ahead and start to answer your questions about it. So the first poll question, how far out do you currently plan? How far out does your organization currently plan? 1 year, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or 10 to 20 years? How far out do you currently plan? 1 year, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or 10 to 20 years? And it looks like a majority of the audience are in that 1 to 5 year planning horizon, which seems consistent with a lot of what we've talked about here so far in the content that's been presented today. Some in the 5 to 10 year and far fewer in the 1 year to 10 to 20 year range. Great feedback from the audience on their current planning horizons for strategic asset management. One other quick poll question to learn a little bit more about how you can get some more information for yourselves. Poll question here is, I'd like more information on how these solutions can help me with strategic asset management through private demonstration, pricing, or all of the above. So if you wouldn't mind taking the time to answer that question as well, that'll again help us provide some more useful feedback for you, the audience, at the end of this webinar. So without further ado, we have plenty of time here for questions and lots of good ones that have come in from the audience so far. I'd like to start with one that's a very, very timely question, and I'll put this to Ashay first and then to Ben. And the question is this: how do we balance the desire to fund the infrastructure deficit for projects that have the largest return on investment with the recognition of systemic racism and environmental justice, where historic investments in infrastructure in, say, white neighborhoods have been significantly more than in Black neighborhoods? So a question here about how to leverage these data tools to be more mindful of ongoing concerns about systemic racism and environmental justice. Ashay, do you want to take a stab at that, and then we can let Ben answer it as well?
Absolutely, great question, terrific question. And whether it's systemic racism or whether it's inequality based on age and demographics or community background or economic background. Yes, we have in a number of societies around the world seen that funding gets either diverted or prioritized on those sorts of bases. Political marginal seats often is where infrastructure funding is often diverted as well. What the platform does is doesn't necessarily say it solves the systemic issues, but what it does, like anything in life, is provides the wisdom. And by wisdom, what I mean is it provides the ability to look at the consequence in the future of decisions that are made today. And those consequences are not just as simple as the roads will get rougher or the facilities will collapse. Those consequences in strategic asset management can be expressed and should be expressed in terms of what is called community level of service. And that community level of service could range from customer satisfaction to mental issues, to delight factors, to livable city notations. There are a number of mechanisms to project and predict those outcomes from existing asset management modeling. But the appetite from the asset management practitioners to undertake that analysis in strategic asset management, and the appetite, like Ben was saying, to then consult and communicate that information through storyboards to politicians and use this information as wisdom to help inculcate change is, I think, where mindset and game shift is slowly shifting the pendulum in our community. And I think as practitioners, we should put more and more effort into making that happen so we can show the politicians, we can show the decision makers, if I take money out of this pot and spread it over these 7 pots here, what is the impact? If I constantly differentiate or disadvantage a certain part of the municipality because of its DNA of any nature, what is the future impact on the community as a whole, not just the pipes collapsing and the infrastructure breaking? And a lot of work has been done by many thought leader organizations in that respect. Ben, if you want to add to that from your practitioner perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we, not so much with the systemic racism, but just in terms of our demographics and trying to spread the spend across the whole community. What we're able to do is we can actually show, and we've got some models that show the impacts of underspend in terms of infrastructure and access to community services. And we do community surveys and different bits and pieces that actually measure those impacts. So we can say that if we don't spend money in certain locations and our assets and infrastructure degrades, there's actually a correlation to mental health, community satisfaction, and we can then start to communicate to the elected bodies around why we need to spend money here and not just in the more affluent or younger, whatever the demographic is that the majority of money is being spent on. The other thing that we can show is that it may not be spent in year one. We might do some higher projects in year one, but we can look at the 10-year view and see the money, where the money's spent over that journey, and making sure that it's actually spread equitably across the community rather than in particular locations.
Terrific. Great answers. Thanks, both of you. Changing gears a little bit, we have another question that's related to professional associations. Actually, in the presentation, you had mentioned that different professional associations, like the Government Finance Officers Association, have placed a real emphasis on the role of strategic asset management. I'm wondering if you could expand on that just a little bit. Why do you believe that associations like the GFOA have taken on asset management as an area of focus?
It is a natural fact of life. Great question. Great question. So if I can just step back in time in history and just present what actually happened in Australia and New Zealand about 20 years ago, with the population in Australia back then of about 19 million, 19 million for the whole country, and about 2 million in New Zealand back then. But an infrastructure base that per capita is phenomenally higher compared to any Western economy. Australia had a major challenge, which was how do we do more with less? And how do we do more with less from a funding perspective gave birth to asset management regulation, because finance professionals were driving the agenda in valuing the infrastructure, as well as making sure that local government, state government, rail, transport, etc., had control of the future. So what was good practice started to turn into regulation, and in fact, very lately, a lot of the regulation gets tied to funding, where funding is distributed based on the maturity of the asset management practice, or reverse that. Unless there is maturity of asset management practice and evidence, then a lot of the grant funding may not be available. So it's a bit of a carrot and stick approach, but for all the right reasons, it evolved strategic asset management, which is why we are now exporting this technology and methodology to different parts of the world. The United States presents a very interesting case, because for many decades, with a very, very rich economy, the ability to fix assets when they break is a really easy option, and nothing wrong with that option as long as there is cash flow able to fix any asset that enters the E and the F zone. But I think governments are now coming to the realization that there isn't enough money to go around. Money needs to be unlocked, and wastage needs to be reduced. And evidence-based planning has to be put in terms of needs-based budgeting. I don't think there is any rocket science in that. GFOA's interest is obviously because a finance professional organization, when you look across the country and look at the trillions and trillions of dollars in infrastructure, with billions and billions of infrastructure deficit escalating every year and every 5 years, they have a fundamental issue on their hands. And they are getting interested in this space because it's in the country's interest to preserve and make sure that this deficit doesn't skyrocket. Canada has already embarked on the pathway of regulation to bring in asset management practice, and asset management plans have now been mandated, which means by 2024, every municipal organization in, for example, the state of Ontario has to have documented, even if they are Generation 1, documented asset management plans. And many of the thought leaders that we are working with have gone down that digital path where they do have live asset management plans right now in the space of water, utilities, road pavements, buildings, facilities, etc. So finance professionals usually around the world take interest when the problem starts to become something that is starting to get out of hand, and when the options of raising taxes runs out, and when the option of saying to the community that the level of service is going to drop is not a palatable option. That's when finance and engineering come together to solve the problem like we have everywhere around the world. And when I say we, I mean the entire strategic asset management fraternity, everyone from custodians through to politicians, through to engineers and accountants.
Very good. Thank you, Ashay. So we have time for one more quick question, and we're going to give this one to Ben. And it's not exactly a quick question, but we'll ask you to give the best short answer you can give, and that is, what's the best advice you have for an agency at the very beginning of this journey? What advice would you give other practitioners who are just starting down this path?
I think the biggest piece of advice I can give would be just to start. Don't look for it to be perfect. To begin with, don't look to have all the information, all the data, everything available. Start with a Generation 1 model, build it, use this to engage your executive, your elected members, your elected body, your community to get buy-in, then refine and then refine and refine. And what you'll find is as you start to engage and get buy-in, you then start to be able to seek funding to go and do more data collection, to be able to start to build your Generation 2 models, to look at, can we start to integrate with smart technology to get real-time data coming in to make decisions. So yeah, that would my answer would be just start, get something moving, and then build.
Terrific. Thank you both again. So I want to be respectful of our time commitment, so we'll need to wrap it up there. In closing, I would just like to thank Ben Clark and Ashay Prabhu for sharing their insights on today's webcast. And I'd also like to thank Dude Solutions for making it possible to have this important webcast discussion today. Thanks as always to you, the audience, for spending the hour with us. We look forward to seeing you again soon at another #GovTech Live event. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.